Welcome back to another very exciting tutorial here at the PhotoshopTrainingChannel.com. My name is Jesus Ramirez, and you can find me on Instagram at JRFromPTC. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to work with bump maps, normal maps, and depth maps in Photoshop. This is going to be a Photoshop 3D tutorial, and even though we're going to discuss advanced and complex topics, I'll try to keep things as simple as possible. Also, remember that you can always pause and rewind the video in case you miss something. The project that we're going to work on is creating a realistic brick wall in 3D. We'll ultimately end up using a depth map, which allows us to create 3D geometry from a flat 2D image using its luminance values. But we'll also discuss bump maps and normal maps, which help fake depth and detail in a 3D object. Okay, let's get started. So this is the image that we're going to work with. It's just a wall. This is an Adobe stock image. I have a link to it right below this video, or you can use any other image of a wall that you like. Now, before we go any further, I do want to point out that if you're working in Photoshop CC and you don't see the 3D menu, that is because your computer probably does not have the minimum requirements for 3D in Photoshop. So I just want to point that out in case you don't see the 3D button in your installation of Photoshop. If you want to know what the minimum requirements are, you can search for Photoshop CC minimum requirements on Google, and you'll see a page from Adobe, and I'll link to that right below this video. So we have this image of this brick wall, and in Photoshop, we can turn this into a 3D shape. So I'm going to click on this layer, then go into the 3D panel. If you don't see the 3D panel, you can just click on the workspace and select 3D. In the 3D panel, I can select the source as selected layers, and I'm going to select 3D postcard and click on create. This is going to make this wall into a 3D object. Notice that my move tool is selected, and with the move tool selected, I can see the 3D widgets here at the bottom left and in the options bar. If I click away to, say, the rectangular marquee tool, you'll see that those go away. So for you to see the 3D options, you need to be in the move tool. And you can rotate around your 3D scene with this little widget here on the bottom left. This is what I like to use, the orbit tool. Click and drag, and you rotate around the 3D scene. The pan tool, it moves it around. And the dolly, which zooms in and out. So this is how I like to navigate through my 3D scene. And you can see now that this wall is, in fact, in 3D space. You will also notice that there's no shape to it. There's no depth. And that is because this is the equivalent of printing out a photo of a wall and pasting it on another wall. Essentially wallpaper is what we just did. There's no depth. And light is not interacting with it. It's not creating shadows. So in certain angles, it won't look very realistic. You might be able to get it realistic in a certain angle, but once you move into a more extreme angle, you'll notice that it's not very realistic. So what we're going to do in this tutorial is learn several techniques to try to make this into a more realistic brick wall. Also, generally speaking, Photoshop creates infinite lights when you create a 3D object. In this case, it did not. So if you come into the 3D panel and you don't see anything labeled infinite light, you can create one by clicking on the light icon and selecting new infinite light. And this creates the infinite light number 1. And with this widget here, you can click and drag that light around and tell Photoshop where the light source is coming from. Notice that the wall really does not interact with the light in terms of creating shadows or highlights in the actual bricks. So what we're going to do now is talk about several different things that you can do to create the illusion of realism. So what I'm going to do now is revert the image. I'm going to press F12 on the keyboard, or you can also go into File, Revert, which brings the image back to your last save point or to what it looked like when it was first opened. So once again, I just have the layer. I'm going to duplicate this layer by pressing Ctrl J, Command J on the Mac. So now I have a wall and a wall copy. In Photoshop, you can apply 3D filters, and these filters allow you to generate a bump map and a normal map. I'm going to click on bump map first. And this is going to open up the generate bump map dialog box here. And you can see a 3D preview of what this bump map is going to do. It's going to fake depth in 3D. It's not really going to alter the shape of the 3D object. You can see the circle is still fairly smooth. There's no real edges, grooves, and bumps. It's just faking that effect. And the way the bump map works is by taking the luminance values of the original image. Anything that is white is going to create the illusion of pushing out. Anything that is black is going to create the illusion of pushing in. And the controls that you have are the blur. If you set the blur to 0, you'll see that you'll get a lot of noise on the image. That's because all the dark pixels and bright pixels are creating the illusion of pushing the pixels in and out on the 3D object. So you usually want to have a little bit of blur so that you get rid of those details and you only keep the major details. And you can adjust the low, medium, and height by clicking and dragging on these icons, and you'll see how that changes and how it updates. Or you can click and drag on the label, or you can just come in here and type a number in. And you can adjust the detail scale if you want to. And any adjustment that you make automatically previews not only in the 3D model here, but also in the background, which is really what we're going to use. And you can select different types of objects, like maybe a cube. Since this is going to be a wall, we can get a better representation of what it's going to look like. And notice that if we go on an extreme angle, we can still tell that it's a flat image, but at least it's interacting with the light. So it's going to help it look a little more realistic. Now I'm going to press cancel because this is not how we're going to create the bump map. I just wanted to show you that this is an option. I'm going to press cancel. And what I'm going to do now is go into the layers panel, make sure the wall copy is selected. In the 3D panel, I'm just going to create another 3D postcard and click on create. And there it is once again in 3D space. And so that things don't get confusing, I'm going to go into the layers panel and disable the wall, the original wall layer. So now we're only looking at the 3D object. And what I'm going to do is double click on the 3D wall object. And once again, I don't have an infinite light. So I'm going to create one, new infinite light. There it is. I can click and drag on it, as you can see. And I'm going to go into the wall copy mesh, open it up, click on wall copy. And for some reason, Photoshop creates an opacity texture. I'm not sure why, but I'm just going to remove it since we don't need it. It just makes things more complicated. So now the opacity texture is now gone. We have this bump map slider here with a folder right next to it. If we click on the folder, we can generate bump map from diffuse. The diffuse is right up here. Diffuse is really the color of the 3D object, or it could be an image that you wrap around it. In this case, the wall is the image that we're wrapping around. So I'm going to generate my bump from the diffuse. Click on that. And once again, Photoshop will bring up the generate bump map dialog box, and we can make adjustments as we did before. Something I didn't mention earlier is that you have this checkbox here to invert the height. But anyway, I'm going to decrease the lows and increase the highs. I think the blur is okay, and this should work at least for this example. So I'm going to press OK. And you'll now notice a little bit of a difference. If I increase the bump, you'll see how the wall looks like it's sticking out more. Also, if I select the infinite light, I can click and move it around, and notice how now the light is interacting with the shape of the wall. So it looks a little bit more realistic than it did before. You can also click on the rectangular marquee tool, click and drag a selection, just a small selection, so that we could render this section. The render button is here. You can also go into 3D, render 3D layer, or you can use the keyboard shortcut Alt-Shift-Control-R. And once you do that, Photoshop will start rendering this section. And rendering means that Photoshop is going to calculate the light, the bump, the diffuse, shadows, and everything else in your scene to make it a final image. And obviously the render time depends on the speed of your computer and the complexity of your scene. And this could take a while. Notice that just for this selection, my computer is going to take roughly 3 minutes to complete. You can press the escape key, and this is a representation of what the entire image is going to look like. What I'm going to do now is just bring down the intensity of the light in the properties panel. I have the infinite light selected, so I can click and drag the infinite light down a little bit so it's not so bright. And I can do another quick render by making a selection with the rectangular marquee tool and clicking on the render button. But anyway, for this example, this is going to be okay. And now you can see how we created a wall that is slightly more realistic than just having it flat on the 3D postcard. So I'm gonna go back into the layers panel, and I'm just gonna delete this layer, and I'm gonna show you now a different technique. So with the original wall layer selected, I'm gonna press Ctrl J, Command J on the Mac. Now we have a second copy, and we'll do the same thing. We'll go into 3D from postcard, and click on create. Now we're gonna talk about the second filter in the 3D menu here. And the reason we can't see it is because we need a pixel layer selected. So filter, 3D, normal map. We're not gonna click on it here, but I just wanted to show you that this was also available in the filters. And I'm gonna go back into the 3D layers. So I'm gonna double click on the 3D layer from the layers panel. Now I'm inside of the 3D panel, and I have the wall copy mesh and the wall copy material. So I'm clicking on the wall copy material. You'll notice the properties panel gives us the materials. And I'll delete the opacity texture once again because we don't need it. We don't have an infinite light, so I'll create an infinite light. So now I can adjust the lighting, maybe bring it down a little bit since I already know that's a little too bright. And from the wall copy mesh, or the wall copy material rather, I can now create a normal map. So I'm gonna generate normals from diffuse. Normals work a lot like bumps. The difference is that bump maps use luminosity to create the illusion of depth. Normal maps use the 3 RGB channels to create the illusion of depth. So you can think of bump maps as only having up and down, and normal maps as having up, down, left, and right. And the dialog box looks a lot like the bump map dialog box, but if you notice in the background, the image looks a lot different. But the way we create it is very similar. So I'm just gonna make a few quick adjustments. We don't need to spend a lot of time on that since you know how these work. They work the same. Once we press OK, Photoshop applies that normal map. If I go into the infinite light, you can see how it interacts with that normal map. And it's actually a little bit better than the last one, than the bump map, because the normal map, as I mentioned, gives you left, right, up, and down. So if I go back into the wall copy material, I can go into the normal and edit the texture. And this is what that looks like. If you open this up and it looks black, it might be because your UV overlay is active and you may have a lot of UVs. So just make sure that you disable the UVs in case you can't see the normal map. And this is what the normal map looks like. Notice that in the channels panel, you have the red, green, and blue channel. Notice how they're all very different. And that is because Photoshop is using each individual channel to create the illusion of depth in different ways. So the final result looks like that. Obviously, this is a little bit harder to edit than working simply with luminance values. So now what I can do is I can also place this into position, and I'll disable the original wall here in the background in the layers panel just so it doesn't confuse us. And I can come back, select the rectangular marquee tool, make a selection, and click on render and see what that render would look like. I'm gonna press the escape key just because I know it's gonna look okay. And as I mentioned before, with the infinite light and pressing the V key on the keyboard, we get all our 3D tools, and I can continue to move this around and you see how the light interacts with the wall. Now, even though this is a little bit better than the bump map, it still has the same problem, which is at an extreme angle, you know that this is a flat image. And even though the light interacts with it, there is just no way around that. We're dealing with a flat image. Luckily for us in Photoshop, there's another way in which we can literally create depth out of an image. So let's take a look at that. I'm gonna go back into the layers panel, and this time I'm just gonna delete the wall copy and just work with the original wall layer. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna duplicate it. Control J, Command J on the Mac. Then I'm gonna go into Filter, 3D, Generate Bump Map. And we're gonna use the luminance values to generate a 3D object. And I'm just gonna leave it with these settings for now. I'm just gonna press OK. And what I wanna do is go into Image, Adjustment, Levels, and I'm gonna try to make the darks darker. And I don't really wanna make the whites whiter. I don't want pure white. So I'm okay having an off-white color. I just need a little more contrast. And press OK. So this is gonna work a lot like a bump map where black pushes pixels in and white pushes pixels out. So I want the separation in between the bricks to be darker and the bricks to be brighter. So I'm gonna come in, select the burn tool, and I'm quickly gonna just start burning in between those bricks. Make sure that your range is set to shadows, exposure is fine at 50%. And I just want to make sure that there's no bright areas in between the bricks. I'm going to go a little faster than I normally would just for the sake of saving time. But I think that you'll get the idea. And once you see the results, you might want to spend a little more time on your image. And I'm not using a Wacom tablet, but a Wacom tablet will probably be a little more accurate. So if you have one, I recommend using it. To be frank with you, is what I would use if I was actually working on a real project and not recording a tutorial. But that's not to say you can't use a mouse if you don't have a Wacom tablet. Okay, I think that'll work. And also, you might want to select the dodge tool and make sure that the bricks are not too dark. And again, for this example, I think this will work. I don't have to spend too much time, so we'll just work with this. Remember, we have the wall copy selected, and that's what we've been working on, and the regular layer is still there. So in the 3D panel, instead of 3D postcard, what I'm going to choose now is mesh from depth map. And a depth map, as I said before, will push in the dark pixels and will push out the bright pixels. And this is actually 3D geometry. So I can select mesh from depth map, make sure that you have planes selected, and click on create. And now you'll see this groovy looking thing here. I'm gonna go into the layers panel and just disable the wall, just so it doesn't confuse us. Back on the 3D panel, I can click on depth map, and you'll see that with the move tool selected, I have this 3D widget here. Let me rotate the camera around so you can see what we created. This is what we created just now. And I can come here and hover over the scale along z-axis. Cube is the blue one. I can click and drag that to the left. And notice that if I come back far enough, now it looks more like a real wall. And I can come into the Orbit 3D camera tool, and you'll see now that this is in fact 3D geometry. We're no longer faking depth. This is actual depth. So I can move that around. I can zoom in, and I can do all sorts of things now. So this is a more realistic wall. And if I press M on the keyboard for the marquee tool, click and drag, hit the render button, and we'll give it a few seconds to render, you'll see how this is a more realistic render. And obviously, if we work with the infinite light, the shadows and highlights will affect the image. Also, notice what happens on this extreme lighting here. Notice how now the shadows are even more realistic because this is real 3D geometry. So you can create some really cool effects. And you may be wondering, how do we edit the colors and maybe add a more realistic texture? Well, we'll do that next. But first, again, Photoshop creates this opacity texture that I don't like, so I'm going to remove it. It just makes things more complicated when we start applying different effects. But what you really want to do to apply a texture onto this wall is go into the diffuse. Notice that we already have a texture here. So I'm going to go into edit texture. That's going to open up in a new tab. And this is essentially the bump map. It's using two instances of the same thing. If we edit this, it will not affect the depth map. If you do want to affect the depth map, you got to go into the depth map layer and click on edit source. And it's going to open up an image that looks just like this. But if you edit that second image, it will affect the 3D geometry. The diffuse texture will not. Anyway, so now we're in the layers panel. I can come back into the bricks PSD that I'm working on, enable that wall background, click, drag it over onto the wall copy tab. I'm still holding, and I'm going to hold shift when I release so it places it in place. So notice how it matches perfectly. I can press Control S, Command S on the Mac to save, go back into the brick PSD, and notice how now it applied that texture onto my brick wall. Let me disable the original wall image so we're only looking at the 3D model. And again, this is the 3D model with depth. And I can adjust the depth if I want to by clicking on the 3D model. When you see the 3D widget, just scale on the Z-axis. So see how that works. And you can adjust the depth accordingly, of course. Another thing that you can do is go back into the 3D layer. Under wall copy, we can edit the diffuse again, but we already have it open on this tab. So I'm going to open up this tab, and I'm going to create a new layer because now we can work on this texture like we can with any other Photoshop document. That means that we can paint on it if we want to. So let me just quickly paint something here. I'll just paint PTC on here. And I can even maybe create a shape layer here and maybe fill it with green just so you can see the difference, and maybe even increase the stroke. Something like that. And to make it a little more realistic, I'm going to double click on the side of the layer here and bring up the layer style window and adjust the underlying layer blend if, just to make it more realistic. Notice that if I hold Alt Option in the Mac, click in the center, it splits those in half and it creates a more gradual transition. What I'm doing here is hiding anything that is darker than this shade of gray. So if it's this shade of gray or darker, it becomes invisible. If it's in between this shade of gray and this shade of gray, then there's a gradual transition. And if it's between this shade of gray and white, then it's 100% visible. So notice what happens when I click and drag on these sliders. I'm gonna press OK, and I'll do the same thing on this shape layer. Split those by holding Alt Option in the Mac and click and drag, just so that they interact better with their background. And on this one, maybe I'll even bring the opacity down. It might be too bright for the effect that I'm going for. And maybe bring the opacity down on PTC as well. Maybe something like that. We don't need to spend too much time with this. I just want to show you how this will work. I'm going to press Control S, Command S to save, go back onto the brick wall, and you'll see that now those graphics are applied to the wall, and obviously they look very realistic because they're applied to the 3D geometry. And I'm just going to do a quick render here so you can see how they look. In my opinion, this is a little too bright, so what I might do is maybe work on the infinite light, maybe even reduce the lighting a little bit, and maybe even rotate it into a different way just to create something more interesting. And obviously for the background here, I could do a sky. And the way that you can create a sky is by maybe creating a gradient and just selecting white and blue, which I already have selected. But if you click on this top one, notice that the opacity is set to 0. So let me bump that up to 100 and maybe select a different kind of blue that may look a little more realistic. So something like that. Obviously you can spend a lot more time, or maybe even use a stock photo. And I wasn't planning on doing this, but I just said it, using a stock photo of a sky here that I've used. So let me use that and you'll see how that works. And this is one of the reasons why I like Adobe Stock and the Creative Cloud. I just have all these assets that I can use for all types of designs. But anyway, this is just something that you can do to create realistic effects and really cool designs using Photoshop, 3D, and I guess stock images. And of course, the final step now will be just to render the image by selecting the 3D wall copy and clicking on the render button. Once you're making your final render, you don't have to make a small selection. You can just simply click on the render button and let it render for as long as it needs to. And one very important thing to note is that even though in this tutorial we use the depth map to complete our project, it doesn't mean that bump maps or normal maps are not as good. They definitely have their place in 3D, and in a lot of cases, they are the better tool for the job. Also, you can apply a bump map or normal map to this depth map to create an even more realistic 3D image. In case you're curious, this is what my final render looks like. I also quickly want to show you another image created using a depth map. This mountain was created using a similar technique as the 3D brick wall that we just created. As you can see, there's a lot of applications for this method of creating 3D geometry. And that's it for this tutorial. I hope that you enjoyed it and that you learned something new. Make sure that you leave all your comments or questions down below. If you create an image using this tutorial or any other of my tutorials, feel free to share it on Instagram with the hashtag PTCvids. I often do a search for this hashtag to see what you're all up to. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click on that like button. If you have a friend who you think might enjoy this tutorial, please share this link with them now. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.